Okay, good morning, everyone. Why don't we just get started? There's only 6 of you here. Well, 8, but 2. Oh, no, there's 7 now. So not very many people here. So let's get started, and people will trickle in as they see fit, and let's do this. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions and you don't want to interrupt me or anything like that, feel free to type it in the group chat. I can see the group chat, and so I can answer your questions without you having to sort of awkwardly interrupt me, I guess. So we're just do a quick recap of of just sort of the basic chemistry. So this is what we spent last class talking about. And we're thinking about chemistry because really biology is directly tied to chemistry. Without understanding how chemistry works, without chemistry, life really isn't life. As we talked about, sort of everything that life does really is associated with performing some sort of chemical reactions. Everything sort of on this planet is made up of atoms. Atoms, remember, have 3 distinct components: protons, neutrons, electrons. Protons being positively charged, neutrons being neutrally charged, and those 2 subatomic particles make up the nucleus. And then we have our electrons, which are negatively charged, which orbit around the nucleus and are negatively charged. When you have a bunch of atoms together that all have very similar chemical properties, remember those are considered in elements. And elements are, things like gold, copper, carbon, so on and so forth. And remember, when we're thinking about an atom is mostly dead space. So if the nucleus was at Pitcher's Mound at Fenway Park, it would be about the size of a marble, and the electrons would be whizzing around outside of the green monster, and they'd be smaller than a pea. And a very happy pea that we have here. We have remember 92 natural elements on the biosphere, and I will just note that outside of hydrogen, all of these elements are created in stars. Just as a note, we're not really a physics or astronomy class, but just figured I'd make note of that. In addition, there are 26 synthetic elements that we've created in a laboratory setting. Physicists do crazy stuff. Remember, each element has an atomic number. This refers to the number of protons it has. It has a molecular weight, and this is just a measure of, if you have a precise number of those atoms, how much it weighs in grams. Remember, there are isotopes, and these are different types of elements that have different numbers of neutrons. So we have carbon-12, which is the normal 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon-13 is an isotope, and it has 1 extra neutron. And we can use isotopes to do all sorts of cool stuff, like trace things through communities. We can use them to date fossils and other things that are interesting. And in addition, there are radioactive elements such as uranium and potassium that decompose, releasing high energy subatomic particles, in principle thinking about neutrons. So when you eat a banana, you are ingesting a little bit of radiation every time, but it's not like you're eating a teaspoon of radioactive uranium or anything like that. Radioactivity is sort of a natural thing. We sort of associate it with being a bad thing, but radioactivity is natural. The sun is powered by nuclear fusion, smashing together 2 atoms. When we have nuclear fission, this is what we're doing in power plants. So this is the splitting of large nuclei to create energy. Of all these 92 elements, remember, there's only just 10 that make up 99.9% of your body. I recently saw a really cool T-shirt on the internet that had an ingredient, like a fake ingredients list for the human, and it had all these elements in all the right proportions, and I thought it was pretty cool. But I'm a big nerd, so remember, the big 4 elements are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. Again, those make up the vast majority of your mass. There are, remember, what we call trace elements that are in much low abundance, such as boron, chromium, cobalt, and so on and so forth. And these can have some pretty deleterious side effects if you have a deficiency. So in this case, this poor woman has a goiter, which is a deficiency of iodine. So some pretty serious health side effects by missing some of these compounds. I should say compounds, these elements, simply because they are important for some things, but they're not as important as, say, carbon to your body. And vitamins have their own thing, and that's not that important. Remember, molecules are when you join two atoms together. So in this case, we have two oxygen atoms joined together by a covalent bond. And you can change the properties of the atoms you join together by making a new thing. So for instance, if I join chlorine with sodium, I make table salt. So I go from a gas and a metal to a salt. And you can join any number of things together, provided there are electrons to share. And remember, when we talked about bonding, it's really just the joining together of two or more atoms, and it really all has to do with how electrons interact between these two atoms. So there are 4 types of bonds, but they all are involved with the sharing or the interactions of electrons with one another. Remember, electrons do reside in orbitals that sort of zing around the nucleus. Think of like a planet's orbiting the sun. And as you increase the orbital stage you're in, you increase the amount of energy that the electrons have. And remember, electrons, they vary. So something like hydrogen only has 1 shell and 1 electron. Helium has, again, 1 shell but 2 electrons. And you basically can only add a maximum number of electrons depending on what shell you're trying to fill. So you're trying to fill the first shell, you can only add 2 electrons. The second shell is 8 electrons, and so on and so forth down. Every shell after the first one is 8 electrons. And remember, when we're talking about bonding, again, it's all about, can they accept electrons? Can they share electrons? Can these electrons interact with one another? And so we talked about sort of this concept that atoms, that it is really their dream to fill their outermost shell. That's really all I want to do. That's the incentive for bonding with another thing. And remember that the periodic table is nicely organized so that you have things that are above and below each other have very similar properties, and that's all due to respect to their electrons. If you have a similar property, it's generally due to how your electrons are organized. So we have the 4 bonding types. We have covalent bonds, which again is the equal sharing of electrons between 2 atoms or more atoms. So in this case, we have 2 hydrogens covalently bonding with one another, and they're sharing electrons. Ionic bonds are similar but quite distinct from covalent bonds when we have 2 oppositely charged things bind to one another. So we have sodium shedding an electron and chlorine gaining an electron, and they become either positively charged or negatively charged. And that opposite, as you all know, opposites attract in the case of thinking about electricity. And so this is what an ionic bond is, something positive binding to something negative. I'll just note that you can't have 2 positive things bound together. They don't do that. Just remember that the periodic table has varying levels of how much you want to fill your outer shell. So things that are on the right side of the periodic table are very electron hungry. They like to fill their shell. They're really happy to get extra electrons, whereas the things on the left-hand side, they're much more happy to give up their electrons because they're very far away from filling their outer shell. And then finally, we have the noble gases here on the far right column, which have fully filled their outer electron orbital, and thus, sorry, I got distracted. I see Kevin Barry has the office as his background. Sorry, I got distracted. I approve. See Stanley there. Anyways, remember the noble gases, they have their electron orbitals filled, and they're stable. They don't interact. They don't bond. They don't really do anything. Hydrogen bonding we've talked about a little bit because it's an important property of water. Water has unequal sharing of electrons in its covalent bond, creating a partial positive charge on the hydrogens and a partial negative charge on the oxygen. This allows a weak interaction between the negative and the positive here. This is what we call a hydrogen bond. And then we talked about van der Waals forces, which is this cool electrostatic interactions, which allows lizards to walk on glass. And our bonds are important. They determine the structure of molecules, and structure and function, remember, are linked together with one another. And water has all these cool properties: cohesive behavior, the ability to moderate temperature, expanding upon freezing, and water being a universal solvent. All these things make water an ideal medium for life. Remember, if there's life, there has to be water as far as we know it. So last time we wrapped up by talking about the pH scale, and just remember the pH scale is simply a measure of the ratio between hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. More hydrogen ions means you're acidic, more hydroxide ions means you're basic. Or basic can also be called alkaline as well. And remember, small changes in the pH scale are meaningful because the pH scale is a log scale, and it causes some pretty deleterious effects, including acidification of lakes, destruction of forests through acid rain, as well as the acidification and the destruction of our coral reefs worldwide. So pH is an important thing. And pH is also important in the medical sense. The pH of your blood is pretty consistent and basically tolerates no change before you kick the bucket. So we're going to talk now and sort of end this part about chemistry and then transition into energy just by talking about organic chemistry, which is the chemistry of carbon. As you saw, carbon is the second most abundant element inside your body, so understanding organic chemistry is a really important thing to understanding life. And so remember, carbon makes up all sorts of interesting things inside your body, structural components, including your cellular membranes, which we'll learn about later in the semester. They also are structural components of plants. So when you hear about roughage in plants, it's the cellulose fibers that are roughage, help clean you out and make you poop better. And then they also form, carbon also forms chitin, which is really abundant in the exoskeleton of arthropods. Carbon also forms your DNA. It also forms your proteins, stuff we're going to cover very shortly. But carbon is the basis of all your food. So anything you eat is carbon-based. And when we're thinking about food, thinking how we get energy from anything, I guess not just us, but pretty much everything on the planet, it basically comes in essentially two different forms. You either get carbohydrates or lipids. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of these terms before. But carbohydrates are simply linked together pieces of sugar. That's all a carbohydrate really refers to. And so if we have just a single sugar, such as glucose or fructose, I'm sure you guys have all heard of those. If we fuse those together, we get what's called a disaccharide, like say sucrose, which is table salt. If we have a single sugar, this is what we call a monosaccharide. You might see those terms on nutritional labels every now and then. If you link many of these together, sometimes, maybe only 3, sometimes hundreds, you get what are called complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides. And a great example of this is actually starch. So linking together starch is actually how plants store their energy from photosynthesis. So something we're going to learn about on the second half of this lecture. When we're thinking about how we digest these things, all we're really doing, and remember, all life really is chemical reactions. And remember, a chemical reaction is breaking and reforming the bonds. So when we're thinking about what digestion is, we're simply breaking links between simple sugars and then breaking the bonds down even further, and that releases ultimately energy for us to power everything about us. And there's sort of this sort of trade-off between, in terms of human nutrition, the short versus long-term energy. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of this before. Eating something very high in simple sugars, such as glucose or even sucrose, you get a pretty quick burst of energy, and then it pretty much tapers off almost instantly, because foods that are very simple sugars are really easy to break down. So if you ever have drawn blood and you're feeling a little bit lightheaded, they always give you something like orange juice or apple juice, because it has really simple sugars to help your body metabolize real quickly and get you back up on your feet. And that's in contrast to foods that have complex carbohydrates, including something like hummus, including things that are like plant fibers, including things like oats and grains. In addition, another really complex carbohydrate is actually the sugars and other things found in breast milk. Breast milk has a really high diversity of rich complex carbohydrates. But what you'll notice is that these complex carbohydrates, because they're bigger, simply take much longer to break down. So you have sustained energy over a long period of time. So I'm sure you guys have probably seen like commercials from like Quaker Oats, like eat this and you'll have energy all day. This is what they're talking about. It takes a long time for it to break down, so you have blood sugar sustained for an extended period of time. In addition, we have to carbohydrates, we have what are called lipids, and these are just really carbon-rich molecules. And lipids are broken down into sort of 3 broad categories. We have fats, which I'm sure everyone here has heard about it at some point in your life. Which are essentially we use for long-term storage of energy that we consume. So if we eat a lot of food and we can't sort of break all of it down and consume all that energy in our sort of everyday life, we store it as fat. And if we eat too much, that's why we get kind of chunky. Well, he's pretty chunky. Yeah, like the sumo wrestler over here. We have what are called sterols, and these are another type of lipids. They help control growth and development. And then finally, we have phospholipids, and these make up your cellular membranes inside your cells. So these are sort of three classes of lipids that we typically think of. But there is a lot of good to lipids. I mean, I remember when I was younger, I remember there was this huge sort of rally against lipids being, eating fatty food is bad. You want to eat fat-free food and, blah, blah, blah. But there is a lot of benefits to actually lipids. You physically can't have 0% body fat. You need physically lipids for any number of different things, but they are a great source of food overall. They store an immense amount of energy that allows them to you can eat a little bit and get a lot from them. And so in terms of the categories of lipids that we think of, we have our two different categories of fats, where we have saturated fats and unsaturated fats. And again, if you pick up any nutritional label here in the United States, and in Europe too, you'll see the proportion of saturated versus unsaturated fats. And these are simply just referred to as what the carbons look like. If something that is a saturated fat, it just means that there's each carbon. So in this case, we have these carbons are black and they're all bound together to one another. They are saturated by hydrogen atoms here. So in this case, they're bound to 2 hydrogen atoms and then 2 carbons. That's what it means by a saturated fat. In terms of an unsaturated fat, there's double bonds stuck in there. And what it does is causes kinks inside these chains of these carbons. But you'll notice, again, these are all carbons, even here, but saturated versus unsaturated. And there's a lot of misinformation out there right now about sort of what types of fats are good, what types of fats are bad. There's really actually no meaningful scientific link between eating unsaturated fats or saturated fats and being less or worse for you overall. It's sort of a moderation thing. If you eat too much of one or too much of the other, it's bad for you. But if you eat things in moderation, then there doesn't seem to be any medical information that shows unsaturated fats are worse for you than saturated fats. That being said, there is some pretty solid evidence out there about hydrogenation. And so this is actually a process that no longer happens, but what we used to do in sort of laboratory settings is we used to hydrogenate our oils and basically trying to essentially forcing in some double bonds here and changing the overall shape. And this ultimately made these fats stickier. When you add more kinks or you change it, you can make it stickier and it can make it sort of stick to your cholesterol in your arteries better and cause all sorts of nasty side effects. So there is lots of evidence that hydrogenated oils are bad for you. I'm sorry, hydrogenated fats. All right, so that's we're going to end it there. So this is sort of the chemistry of the food we eat. But let's talk physically how. So let's hop on over. Come on. Sorry, it's like blocking my thing. I can't. There we go. So let's talk about what we physically do once we have this energy. How do we go from sunlight to food on the table? As I mentioned last class, that's how everything goes. It goes from sunlight to table. And then once it gets inside you, it does some stuff, right? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how organisms use energy, how we get energy, how ecosystems get energy, how energy essentially controls everything. So energy, you need to think about it like it's flowing through an ecosystem. And an ecosystem can be, say, a forest, it could be a savanna. You could even think of your own body as an ecosystem. As you will learn in a couple classes, you are chock full of microorganisms. So you are your own ecosystem. And so energy flows through ecosystems, whether it's your body, whether it's the forest that is right behind me. And energy flows through it. And it typically starts from the sun. The sun is just pounding us with energy every second of every day. Our earth is just baked in more energy from the sun that we could ever possibly process, even if the entire planet was covered in plants. And so the energy from the sun is then taken up by plants. They photosynthesize. This is a term you guys have probably all heard, and we're going to go through it. And once they photosynthesize, they make it into essentially a chemical food They're taking this solar energy, making it into chemical energy, and then that chemical energy is then eaten by predators. And they use it in a process. That chemical energy is used in a process called cellular respiration, which leads to that animal getting energy. So again, we're distilling the massive amounts of energy that's coming off the sun by photosynthesis into sugar. That sugar is then uptaken by an animal, which is then it uses to make energy to power itself. So energy, and then I will also just mention that once this animal dies, that energy is then returned to the planet as well. And so sort of before we go on, we need to, I think I froze. At least you guys all, oh, there we go. So before we sort of go on to talk about energy, we need to mention what are called the thermodynamic laws. And so anytime you hear sort of a law in science, it's not like a law in like, you know, like a courtroom. It's like when you think about a scientific law, it's sort of the highest standard. It's something that applies everywhere at all times. So it's something that's remarkably consistent. Like think about like gravity, right? Gravity is a law. It applies, gravity applies everywhere, right? You can see if I toss a coin, it comes back down, right? Gravity works all the time everywhere. So a law is a really stringent sort of scientific definition. Thermodynamic laws are important to think about how energy flows, and there's several of these, and they're much too sort of in-depth to sort of jump into for the purposes of this course. But the one thermodynamic law we need to talk about is actually this concept that energy can be converted, but it simply can't be destroyed, and energy can never be created. You can't make energy from nothing. You have to have something. And once you make that energy, it is never really destroyed. It can change forms, but it's always there. And so what I mean by this is if we think about a couple of examples here, right? We have energy from the sun, and that energy comes in the form of light and heat. It comes down, and the energy can be stored by plants, or that energy is reflected back up and escapes the planet. That energy is still there. It's not lost. It's just sort of left the system, right? It's left the planet. But that energy from the sun is always going to be there. It's never going to be destroyed. It's just changing form. In this case, it's changing into chemical energy from photosynthesis, or it's turning into heat. In addition, we could think about a race car driving or any car driving. You're taking the energy found in gasoline. Race cars use just regular gasoline, I'm assuming. I don't know. I'm not a race car person, but you take the energy stored in the fuel here, and you're converting that energy into kinetic energy. But a portion of that energy is not converted just to kinetic energy. It's converted into heat energy. So you have the cars start to get hot as you drive them. Again, changing forms, but not destroying the energy. The energy that was originally found in that gas is still there, just in a different form. And I'll just note that the kinetic energy of the car, i.e. the energy of the car moving forward, the car will eventually slow down, but that energy is actually going into the dirt, right? Or going into the pavement, right? So the energy is still physically there. And then finally, we can think about humans. We have someone running. They're taking the chemical energy of food that they've eaten, and they're using it to essentially make themselves go forward, right? So they're taking the energy in the food, making it into muscle power, and then that muscle power allows them to go forward. But remember, as we move, we're also losing a small proportion of our energy as heat. Right? You radiate heat throughout the day, right? Simply because you're converting that energy in your food to movement, to talking, to listening, to all the things your body does, and some portion of that energy is lost as heat. But again, it's not created, it's not destroyed, it's still there, it's just in a different form. It's an important thing to remember. You can't make energy from nothing. You have to physically have something to make it from. And so I've sort of mentioned this first term before, but there are two important terms to think about when we're thinking about energy. We have kinetic energy, which is simply the energy of movement. Anything that's moving, anything that's doing, talking, listening, right? That involves kinetic energy of some point. It's just the energy of motion. That's in contrast to potential energy, which is the capacity to do or perform or to make something have kinetic energy. And this sort of, we can sort of think about this in a couple different ways. The easiest way to sort of think about it is if you're standing at the top of a hill on skis, you have that potential energy to go down that hill, right? You have the potential to slide down that hill because of gravity, but you're not physically moving yet. But you have the potential to move because of gravity, but you're not moving yet. So that's what I mean. It's the potential to move. It's like, think of it like almost like stored energy. From a biological concept, potential energy is going to be something like glucose, right? Sugar, right? We have the energy stored in glucose itself. And that energy that's stored in glucose, that's stored in those chemical bonds, has the potential to power an animal, to power a human, for you to listen, for you to talk. And so that's sort of the sort of two broad categories. Kinetic energy is once you're physically doing something, and potential energy is the potential to do something. And so the sort of the top of the sort of the top of the system when we're thinking about bringing energy into any given system is this concept of photosynthesis. And so photosynthesis, I would be hard pressed to think any of you haven't heard of it at this point, but photosynthesis is simply the conversion of energy, light energy, into chemical energy. And plants do this so that they can take carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and fix that carbon dioxide into sugar. And then that sugar is what they then use to make themselves a plant, right? And so we think about a very tiny plant. It's photosynthesizing in its leaves. It's taking all that carbon from the atmosphere, using the energy from photosynthesis, and making sugar, and allowing it to grow from a tiny plant to a large plant. And so by doing this, it's capturing all the mass of carbon from the air and converting it into physical plant mass. So when plants are growing, they're not taking mass from the soil, they're capturing mass directly from the air. It's sort of a weird concept to think of, right? Air has weight, right? When you move your hand through air, when you, say, drive in the car and you feel the wind pressing against you, that's the mass of the air hitting you. Sort of a weird concept to think about, right? Air has mass. We move through it so easily, but air has mass. And when a plant grows, and when it's performing photosynthesis, it's taking that mass from the air and making sugar for it to grow. Again, weird concept to think about, but that's just what's going on. And so when we're talking about light, light is a pretty complex thing, at least light that comes from the sun. And so light that comes from the sun falls into what we call the electromagnetic spectrum. And the electromagnetic spectrum is simply any type of energy that's in the universe. And so when we're thinking about electromagnetic energy, it's in the form of a wave. So when we obviously can't see this because it is so infinitesimally small, but when the light is coming down from even a light bulb, it's coming in a form of a wave. When light is coming from the sun, it's coming in the form of a wave. And waves can have different intensities, they can have different wavelengths. And so when we're talking about wavelength of light, when we're talking about the wavelength of any electromagnetic radiation, the wavelength is simply peak to peak here, or in this case, trough to trough, one of the two. That's wavelength, how spread apart this wavelength of energy is. And so that's wavelength. Intensity refers to how short that wavelength is. So then that has very high intensity has a very short wavelength. So for instance, in this case, this has much higher intensity energy than this, simply because the shorter wavelength is essentially bouncing up and down much faster than this sort of gradual movement. And so as I mentioned, when the sun is emitting light, it emits a whole spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. So as the sun is fusing the hydrogen atoms together, it's releasing all this energy, and this energy is in the form of electromagnetic radiation. And so what's coming in from the sun is not just the visible light that we can physically see. There's a whole spectrum of energy that we can't see. For those of you that like watching documentaries on space on the Discovery Channel or National Geographic and stuff like that, you hear about this stuff a lot. It's a pretty common thing to talk about. But the electromagnetic spectrum, again, it's a spectrum. So there's many different intensities of light that have different size wavelengths. And we have very sort of long wavelengths, very low intensity energy in the form of, say, radio waves. and infrared rays. So when you sort of use your television remote, that's using infrared radiation to change the channel. And these are what we typically think of as sort of like non-harmful, or what's called non-ionizing radiation. It's very safe radiation. You know, you've been baked in radio waves your entire life, and you're A-okay with that. And then you have the visible light spectrum, so what we physically can see. And what you'll see, it's a very small band of electromagnetic radiation. There's a very small amount of energy that comes from the sun that we actually can physically see. It's a very narrow spectrum. And so you sort of see that spectrum of, you know, red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, and violet, right? That very narrow spectrum of visible light. And then as we move up to the later part, we have ultraviolet light, X-rays, and gamma rays. This sort of latter part, as you see, is the wavelength is getting very, very short. The radiation is getting much higher intensity. This is what we call ionizing radiation, and this is bad radiation. So, you know, if you ever watch that documentary on HBO about Chernobyl, gamma rays, ionizing radiation, very, very dangerous. X-rays, as I'm sure you all know, are very dangerous as well. And then for those of you that are like me, that are very light-skinned, you know that ultraviolet light is not so fun, and it can be particularly dangerous. But just as a note, electromagnetic spectrum is a sort of a wide range of things. But when we think about life, when we think about photosynthesis, the only type of light we actually physically care about for photosynthesis is actually this visible light. Most of biology, I'd say, I don't want to say all of biology, because I'm sure there's some crazy biology out there that can use some of these weird wavelengths of radiation, but pretty much all of biology that we know can only really sense visible light, this very narrow band of light. And I'm just going to mention one other thing. Cell phone radiation falls around about here, 5G included. Non-harmful radiation, no deleterious side effects, just saying. There's no science behind 5G and coronavirus or 5G and sickness or anything like that. Just gotta say it, just because it's my duty. So let's move on. And so photosynthesis, again, remember, taking advantage only of that visible spectrum of light, is carried out by plants, algae, and bacteria. So organisms that perform photosynthesis are what we call autotrophs or autotrophs, depending on how you say it. And these organisms provide all the energy that life really needs. All the energy that you see trees, you think about like going to get a cupcake, right? All that had to start with these photosynthetic organisms performing photosynthesis. That's how all things start, with some form of photosynthesis. I also want to note, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, but about half of the photosynthesis on the planet is actually carried out by bacteria. So about 50% of all the oxygen you breathe on an everyday basis is produced by bacteria in the oceans. The other half is produced by plants, and algae produce a small amount, but it's mostly bacteria and plants. So, fun fact. Photosynthesis is carried out at the cellular level, so inside the cells of plants, and it's carried inside what's called an organelle. An organelle, as we'll learn about in a few classes, is just a fancy term for a small organ. All cells have organelles, at least plants and animals, and they just perform specialized functions. And so photosynthesis is performed in the chloroplast, which is a specialized organelle inside only plant cells. And you'll notice that there's a lot of organization to a plant's chloroplast. It's sort of organized into little stacks of Oreos or little stacks of cookies, which I always found nice. These little stacks of cookies are called thylakoids. Sorry, it's just, never mind. So these little stacks of Oreo cookies are called thylakoids, and these are the site of photosynthesis. This is where photosynthesis happens. This is where all the light energy is captured in terms of where it happens in the chloroplast. Then we have the stroma, which is sort of the space that is not thylakoid, and this is where the synthesis part happens. And we'll get into that in a second, because photosynthesis is a two-step process. We have sort of what's called the light reaction, and then we have what's called the synthesis reaction. And if you look at a plant cell under a microscope, it looks like this. So this is just an underside of a plant leaf at a few hundred times magnification. And you can see that the plant cells are sort of organized in a nice rigid shape, but you see that each plant cell contains sometimes, will typically contain at least 3 chloroplasts. Sometimes they'll contain hundreds of chloroplasts. It depends on the species of plant. But what you'll notice is that, sort of thinking a section of the plant, we have the top, the bottom of the plant leaf, the top of the plant leaf, and then we have the cells. And you can see that it's just jam-packed with chlorophyll. So that being said, what gives plant leaves their green color is, again, this chlorophyll, because is these chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are filled with a compound called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is sort of this chemical, what's called a pigment. Sort of got this. Do I have a picture of it? Yeah. So chlorophyll's got this sort of crazy structure right here. It's the light capturing pigment inside chloroplasts. And what it does is it physically, as a structure, captures red and blue light. And what it does actually is it reflects back green light. And so for those of you that sort of haven't thought about this, the color that things appear is reflective shows you what type of light it reflects. So if you have a green surface, it reflects green light back at your eye. It absorbs all other wavelengths of light. If you have if you have a red surface, it reflects red light back to your eye and absorbs all other wavelengths of light. But photosynthesis is, again, the capturing of light from the sun is carried out by chlorophyll. It captures red and blue light, reflecting green light back into your eye, which is why plant leaves appear green. But ultimately, when we're thinking about photosynthesis, the first step is thinking about the light reaction or the photoreaction. And this happens, again, in those thylakoids, those stacks of Oreos. The idea being is you have chlorophyll. They capture that sunlight. They combine it with water. And what they make a couple things. First, they make oxygen. So this is the oxygen that we breathe. And second, they make what are called energy storing molecules. And these energy storing molecules, one we're going to talk about pretty heavily in a minute, is called ATP, and I'll define that later. And another type is what's called NADPH. Don't remember that. You don't need to know it. But the important thing is it's sunlight, water, combined with the chlorophyll, make energy and oxygen. So that's step one. That's the light reaction. And it's actually kind of cool to think about sort of how those thylakoids, those Oreo stacks are organized. In a single chloroplast, there's lots and lots of these sort of chloroplasts linked up together, and they act as sort of like a trampoline park, bouncing light till they finally get to sort of this reaction center. Just as a note, it doesn't happen like on the spot. It like bounces it around. It's kind of a cool thing, but beyond the point here. I also should like to mention there are other pigments found in these thylakoids. They're much less common than chlorophyll is, and these pigments that exist in leaves help protect plants from harmful light. And so there's a couple different types of pigments we think about. There's carotene or carotene. This is a yellowish pigment. And then we have anthocyanins, which is a reddish pigment. And what these do is they help protect plants from harmful light. Essentially, they absorb wavelengths of light that are non-ideal for photosynthesis, thus improving the efficiency of photosynthesis. So the kind of I know I froze. Hey, I'm back. Sorry, I froze. So just wanted to sort of just tell you a cool New England thing, because I think it's important to appreciate all the cool, beautiful colors we have in New England. But plants, when they're starting to sort of get ready for winter, they pull in all their chlorophyll from their leaves. And what that leaves behind are these other types of pigments, these reds and the yellow pigments. So that's why during the fall, we start to see these beautiful reds and yellows in the leaves, and the oranges come from a mixing of the reds and the yellows. And then eventually, as the plant starts pulling all these pigments in, you're really left with no pigment, which leaves the plants brown. So if you ever wondered how sort of the plants change color, it's simply how they're pulling these pigments in from their leaves year in and year out. So, but again, these pigments, they're not just beautiful, they serve as a way to improve photosynthetic efficiency, to protect the chlorophyll, making sure the chlorophyll only really absorbs the ideal wavelengths of light. So just to reiterate, the light reaction, sunlight, water, inside the thylakoids make energy storing molecules, as well as oxygen. And that energy storing molecule is what we call ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. This is the energy currency of all life on the planet, from the smallest bacteria to the biggest whale. Everything at the cellular level uses ATP as an energy currency. You don't just take the sugar and do stuff with it. You don't have electrical energy running through your cells. Well, you do in your nervous system, but that's different. The energy currency of your cells, the way you do stuff, the way you listen, the way I'm talking, the way you move, it's all powered by ATP. And this molecule has very, very high potential energy, so the capacity to make things move. And it's a really sort of simple molecule. You have ATP. You'll notice it's just a bunch of carbons here and nitrogens, and attached to a bunch of phosphorus over here. But the way ATP works is by breaking one of these bonds. Again, remember, chemistry is all about breaking and reforming bonds. By breaking one of these bonds, you separate a phosphorus group away, and you produce a lot of energy. And by producing the energy, then you can you break that bond, and you essentially attach that phosphate group to whatever you're trying to work on. So say you're trying to make an enzyme do its thing, or a protein. You break this bond, you stick it on your enzyme, and that makes the enzyme go. It provides the enzyme with energy. It's a really sort of simple way of doing it. And once you break that bond, you get all that energy out, you do whatever work you need to do, you're left what's called adenosine diphosphate, which is just one less phosphate, right? Because you took that phosphate and you stuck it on whatever you needed energy for. And so that's the way energy works at the cellular level. Take ATP, you take off one of its phosphates, you stick it on something else, and that makes whatever you do have kinetic energy. It's a really simple energy currency, which I think is nice. But remember, this is the energy currency of the cell. This is what we're trying to make. Anything like when you eat food, if I go out and eat a big burrito from Chipotle, I'm trying to make ATP. That's what I'm trying to make. Because I can't power my cells with Chipotle, I have to power it with ATP. So this is the end product of everything you do. And plants are no different. So just to reiterate, plants, when they're doing this photo reaction here, this light reaction, they're making ATP. And they're also making oxygen as a byproduct. But ATP is what they're trying to make. Because they make ATP because, think about it this way. If I was, say, a plant and I'm photosynthesizing all day, I might make too much energy, right? Say I'm in the kitchen. I am in the kitchen. But I was in the kitchen this morning making soup. I made a big crock pot full of soup this morning that I'm going to eat. But I can't eat all that soup today. So I need a way to store that energy, right? Plants need a way to store all the energy they take in from the sun. And so what they do is they pair that light reaction with what's called the synthesis reaction, or carbon fixation. And the idea being is it takes the energy from the sun, that ATP, combines it with carbon dioxide in a process called the Calvin cycle. There's a whole bunch of chemistry that goes on there that we're not going to talk about. And it makes sugar. And it stores that energy in the form of sugar. Very, very simple sugars. That synthesis reaction occurs in the stroma so it's not in the thylakoids, it's not in those Oreos, it's just in the sort of the area around those thylakoids. I will note that it is carried out by an enzyme which is called Rubisco. It is the most abundant enzyme on the planet. I don't know if you're ever going to hear it, but if you've never heard of Rubisco before, now you have. It's kind of a big deal. But the synthesis reaction, again, taking the energy from the light reaction, combining it with CO2 inside the Calvin cycle, and making sugars. And those sugars, the plants can either use to make ATP, or they just store those sugars. And now on say, a cloudy day like today, when there's not very much sunlight up and there's not very much photosynthesis, well, now these plants have energy to do whatever they need to do, to grow, to function their immune system, to make more roots, to make more shoots, right? So the synthesis reaction allows them to take all that energy from the sun, concentrate it into a sugar, which then can be used down the line. And so we can think about sort of putting this all together. We take that, again, that energy from the sun, it's captured in chlorophyll, it's combined with water to make ATP and oxygen. That is then shuffled over, and I will mention that the water is absorbed principally through the roots of the plant. Sometimes plants will pull water directly in from their leaves, but that's not particularly very common, especially here in Massachusetts. If you lived on the California coast, plants are all about pulling water in from their leaves over on the California coast, but not here. So they're taking the sunlight, pulling in water from the environment somewhere, capturing it in their chlorophyll, making oxygen and ATP. They're taking that ATP, shuffling it over to the synthesis reaction, pulling in carbon dioxide, fixing that carbon dioxide into sugar. So ultimately, what you need to remember from photosynthesis, California coast is pretty beautiful. So you are very lucky, Logan. So the ultimate reaction you need to think about here for photosynthesis, big picture wise, and this is all that really matters for photosynthesis. I don't care about all the specifics or anything else I just told you. Big picture, what you need to remember, sunlight, water, CO2 makes oxygen and sugar. That's it. That's the most important thing about photosynthesis. Big picture photosynthesis. And I just will note, plants do exchange gas through their leaves. They can also exchange gas through their roots, but mostly it's through their leaves. So, and the gas exchange occurs through, I always thought these looked kind of weird, but that's just me. They're in these openings on the underside of plants called stoma. And so stoma open to essentially gulp, pull in gases from the atmosphere, and then they close once they sort of have all the gas they need. That's how plants pull in oxygen. And these stoma occur essentially on the underside of plants. So you always have, the top of the plant, which is usually waxy, a waxy layer of cells called a cuticle that allows, sort of minimizes water loss for these plants. And no gas exchange really occurs through the leaves here, but gas exchange occurs, again, through these stomas. CO2 enters, oxygen exits. That all happens, again, on the underside of the leaves and through these stomas. And there's an important sort of thing to note here about these. If a plant sort of exchanged gas at any point, if it didn't have this sort of waxy cuticle layer, it would lose water like crazy. Plants already lose water like crazy, even with this massive, with this really thick layer of waxy cuticle cells. They already lose a lot of water through their cells. So when you go, say, walking through the forest or you go walking through some brush, it's oftentimes more humid in those sort of woody areas than it is, say, if you were in the city, right? And this is because the plants are they're losing water like crazy. They're pulling in water from the roots, and the water, as it heats up inside the cells, it evaporates. And so plants have developed sort of three distinct groups of plants and three different types of photosynthesis to sort of get around this idea of how much water you can lose relative to how active you are. And so the three types of photosynthesis we have are C3, C4, and C4/CAM, sort of like a hybrid between C4. And what you'll notice is that the vast majority of the planet is dominated by C3 plants. And we'll get into that in a second. But what you'll notice is that C4 plants only really occur in very specific areas. And you'll see that they occur here in northern Africa, most of Australia, sort of northern China and the Middle East, parts of South America, as well as the American Southwest. Anybody want to take a guess as to why maybe a C4 plant would grow only in those areas? You don't find them anywhere else. You just find them here in these areas. Anyone want to take a guess at what's in all these yellow areas? Guys make me sad. Yep, so it's dry areas. So all the yellow areas, good job, Bree. All the yellow areas are deserts, right? Northern Africa is a just giant desert, right? The American Southwest, desert. Australia, one giant desert. This part of the world, desert. So C4 plants actually live only in very dry areas. And so the way these photosynthesis works is pretty clever, I would say. So regular C3 photosynthesis, so when you go out into, say, Boston, you see any plant in Boston, they're doing C3 photosynthesis. And C3 photosynthesis is very simple. They're doing photosynthesis during the day because you need light to do photosynthesis. And they have their stomata, or that stoma, open all day. So they're always taking in gases. They're always exchanging gases. C4 plants, what they do is they have their stoma only very slightly open. So they're essentially minimizing the amount of time their stoma is open. And that's in contrast to what are called CAM plants, which during the night, that is when they have their stomas open. During the day, their stomas are completely closed. But these other two, C3 and C4, they have their stomas open during the day, whereas CAM plants only open their stoma at night. The idea being is, if you have your stoma open during the night, you minimize the amount of water you lose. Simply because during the day, you lose a lot of water. But during the night, where there's no sun, you're going to lose less water. Thus, having your stoma open during the night allows you to use less water, allows you to grow in drier areas. And so just, Millie, go home. Go home, Millie. Sorry, my neighbor's dog is visiting. Go home, Millie, go. Mills, I'm sorry. In case you guys want to see the dog. She's cute. So, sorry about that. Sorry, she's my dog's best friend. So, anyways, so just to wrap up photosynthesis, it's converting that energy from the sun, which is on that, nice stickers, which is on the, again, that electromagnetic spectrum. It's combining sunlight and water and carbon dioxide to make oxygen and sugar. That's really all that matters. That process of photosynthesis simply provides essentially 99% of all the energy that any animal or any being on the planet uses is provided by photosynthesis. Energy currency of our cells. And respiration is pretty straightforward. This is what we do inside of our cells all the time. And the idea being is that every cell on the planet, from the smallest bacteria to the biggest whale to every species of plant on the planet, performs cellular respiration. And when organisms are essentially only consuming food, whether it's plant material or animal material, these organisms we call heterotrophic. But the sort of the big picture for respiration is simply converting oxygen and sugar into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So this is respiration, taking in oxygen, consuming it, making energy from that to break down the bonds in the sugar to make your ATP. And as a byproduct, you make CO2 and water. Respiration occurs in a part of your cells, in a part of plant cells called the mitochondria, colloquially known as the powerhouse of the cell. And it essentially looks like, I don't know, I always thought it kind of looked like a stack of lunch meats inside of like a big bean. And this organism has what we call the intermembrane space, and then it has what's called the mitochondrial matrix. And it's just like, again, it looks like it's just a stack of like lunch meats on top of each other. And this process of respiration occurs in this organelle. It's in its own little specialized structure. And this happens because this process of respiration that we typically think of, that we do, is aerobic, meaning it requires oxygen. And it requires oxygen. And one of the sort of the byproducts of using oxygen as your metabolism, it produces all sorts of nasty stuff. And by housing it inside the mitochondria, it sort of keeps the rest of your cells safe. But this is where respiration is occurring inside the mitochondria of plants and animals as well. In addition, we can also do what's called anaerobic metabolism. And anaerobic metabolism is metabolism in the absence of oxygen. So sort of regular cellular respiration, we use oxygen as an electron acceptor, and we make water out the back product. When oxygen is lacking, we use different types of electron acceptors, either pyruvate or acetaldehyde in yeasts. And the byproduct is either lactic acid in humans or alcohol in yeast. So for those of you that like wine or beer, or I guess any alcoholic beverage for that matter, this anaerobic respiration is what they're doing, these yeasts are doing. But inside your cells, this actually happens. So if you're at the gym and you're lifting weights or you're running really far and you're using a lot of oxygen, right? You're taking in a lot of oxygen, you're consuming a lot of energy to make yourself run, right? To make yourself lift weights more. And your muscles will sort of start to feel, over time, they'll start to hurt, right? Those of you that have ever like done intensive workouts, when you do it a lot, your muscles will start to hurt. It's because what's happening is as you use more and more oxygen, as you exercise more vigorously, what you're doing is actually physically consuming most of the oxygen inside your muscles, and you've switched to anaerobic metabolism. Thus, you're producing lactic acid inside your muscles the more exercise you do, which makes your muscles tired. So, fun fact. There's a nice little YouTube video here that explains that process. You can take a peek at it if you're interested. But in addition, we use fermentation to make food. We use it to make beverages. So for those of you that like pickles or sauerkraut or kimchi or certain other types of fermented vegetables, it's all made through this anaerobic metabolism. Again, here's a nice little YouTube video about that process. I think it would be kind of weird to watch YouTube videos virtually with one another, so I'll just leave you to it. These are, they're not very long videos. They're like 5 minutes. If you have time, I recommend taking a peek. But ultimately, when we're thinking about respiration, you can stick any type of energy you want in there. Yes, kombucha is a very, in my opinion, it's a kind of a gross fermented drink. The little SCOBY on top is nasty, but that's just me. Anyways, we can stick whatever we want in our metabolism to make it work. And so we think about, metabolism is typically based upon sugars, right? We take sugars, we break them down into simple sugars, and it goes through this multi-step process inside your mitochondria to make you ATP, right? That energy. But you can also take fats and proteins and convert them into different types of compounds and then shuffle them into your respiratory chain here. So, but ultimately it has to some way be converted into something that resembles sugar so that it can then be used down the line. And so for those of you that like, I don't know, like say like eat a lot of protein because you like to work out, what you're physically doing is taking that protein, converting it to some other form, and then using that in your metabolism. Or you're using it, or you're breaking down that protein into what are called amino groups, which are then used to make your own proteins. But I remember someone asked me this one time a couple years ago, like, I don't take that whey protein that I'm eating and convert it directly into my own proteins, and it doesn't work that way. You don't take anything directly from your food and put it into your body in terms of like structures. You break it down into its simplest components, and then you make it into your own components, just as a note. And then just sort of heading towards the end of the lecture here, there are sort of thinking about respiration, there are sort of two distinct types of metabolic pathways that we can think about. We have what are called anabolic pathways. So we're taking small molecules and assembling them into larger molecules by using energy. But respiration is what we call a catabolic process, where we take large molecules and we break them down into smaller ones, thus releasing energy. But ultimately, just thinking about sort of what we need to know about respiration, there's a lot that goes on in this sort of cellular respiration box. And it's much sort of, it's way too in-depth for what you guys would care about. It would take me a couple of classes to go through this entire box here with the details, but you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't like me. Not that you like me now, but you would really not like me if I went through this entire box. But ultimately, we're taking respiration as a whole. We're thinking about taking oxygen, combining that with sugar. And remember, even if you're eating just protein, you convert it into something that resembles sugar, and then you combine that with oxygen. But everything has to be converted into sugar first, or something that resembles sugar. And that the oxygen is combined with the sugar to break the bonds, reform new bonds, and thus making ATP, which then that ATP, again, is what powers everything inside your cells. As a byproduct of respiration, you make carbon dioxide and water. So you take in oxygen as an organism and you breathe out CO2, and you also have some water. You breathe out water vapor, but it's not just because of respiration. In addition, just sort of as a last thing, just sort of a nice little YouTube video about how fossil fuels are made. So we think about, powering ourselves. It's all by food, and it's all by photosynthesis. But even the energy that we use to power our homes, the energy we use to power our vehicles, is actually from it originated from the sunlight anyways. So we think about coal, we think about gas, we think about natural gas. It all originated from something photosynthesizing, converting it into some other form, and then dying and getting compressed into the fuels that we know today. So everything about again, just sort of as an important note about energy in your life, everything really comes from the sun. 99.9% of the energy that is used on this planet by biological organisms is from the sun. There's all sorts of other weird metabolisms out there that we'll talk about when we talk about bacteria, but 99% of that energy that we use as humans, that most animals use, is from the sun. And yes, that is corn on the end of his gas thing in this picture here. I think I pulled this picture a couple of years ago. I think it's because of it's an ethanol. This is an ethanol gas pump, and so it's like ethanol's bioethanol made from corn. So they have the corn, anyways. But ultimately, even sort of just to note, everything is powered by the sun. That's sort of the key things to remember here. That even like our cars, our homes, everything is powered by the sun in some way, shape, or form overall. So, and with that, that's going to wrap up our lecture today about energy and chemistry, I guess. We're going to transition tomorrow to talking a little bit about DNA. And then from there, we're going to talk next week about evolution and how life came to be on the planet. So getting to actual talk about cool biology as opposed to chemistry and energy. So, with that, if you guys have any questions, I will hang around. And remember, if you have any questions, you can feel free to drop a question on the discussion board on Blackboard if you don't feel comfortable doing that. You can also email me. That's my dog, Snickers, in case you wanted to know what she looks like. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I'd be more happy to answer them. But do remember, class tomorrow, no class Friday. You have a problem set due on Friday. We've sort of covered the vast majority of the topics on the problem set, so you might want to take a peek at it and let me know if you have any questions on it, if something doesn't make sense, or you're having difficulties answering a question. All right, so with that, I will let you guys go. I'm going to stop sharing.